our administration when we I don't know. Is there a presentation here?
Yes, this evening we have 3 Arizona School Board Association policy advisories that are being provided for first reading. And these policy advisories have change recommendations from ASBA. And the first one is policy DKB salary deductions. And Scott is here.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the board, good evening. Up until a couple of years ago, staff who wanted to join the CEA or who were members of the CEA could fill out a form and our payroll department would withhold those dues directly from salaries and send them in to their representatives. In 2011, a law came in that it made that very complicated and difficult to do. Statements had to be gotten from people and also from the organizations that the funds went to, stating whether or not they were political in nature and what percentage of these monies were going to be used for political purposes. And the fines or penalties were quite steep for not doing it exactly right or maintaining records. And so Creighton stopped that service at that point, and simultaneously AEA challenged that law and got an injunction that has been in place for a couple of years, and that injunction is now permanent. So the law essentially is gone away, and so this new policy would sort of put things back to where they were before that law was passed.
So is the policy, we adopted the policy then on the paycheck deductions and now we are removing it, is that correct?
It's this, we added a bunch of language that required the statements and had the fines in there and things like that. And this policy just strikes that language that was added a couple of years ago.
Okay.
Essentially.
Questions on that policy?
So Scott, does going back to the old process, what does that do in terms of operational, just process for you? Does that increase staff burden? Does that increase, the need to communicate? How are we communicating to members, CEA, and alike that this now is an option again? Can you talk about some of the implementation logistics?
It's not a tremendous burden. If you wanted to go back and offer that service again, you certainly could do that.
And is that a collaborative kind of communication to staff, letting them know from us and CEA, or
Sure.
do we communicate separately, or and historically, how has that gone? Or how might it be a good way moving forward?
I imagine we could do that collaboratively, and that might come out of the Human Resources Department with the technical part from us, what they need to do, what kind of form they need to fill out, et cetera, to take advantage of that.
Any other questions on this policy? No, we can move to the next one, 469.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Wall.
Mr. President, Governing Board, the next policy is Policy Advisory number 469, and it covers the EBC, RA, RB, RC, RD, REE. The major issue with this in ARS statute 15341 is the fact that emergency response plans need to be developed separately per site. All along, we've had these procedures from pages 9 through 17 that were not unique, but district-wide. The move to the incident command structure that was put down from the federal government to the state on emergency response plans requires that the district now develop these emergency response plans in accordance with assistance from not only the police department, but the fire department and the emergency response personnel. It also makes a real good point here is the fact that if you have an emergency response plan or your deck of cards per se, why would you ever put your deck of cards or put your hand out to make it publicly available to anyone to know what you're going to do if they come on your campus and do something? So the whole reason for removing pages 9 through 17 is not to get rid of emergency response plans, but to no longer make them publicly available to the public unless they're requested and legal counsel and the superintendent approve it. At the same time, every time if your procedures are in policy, then every time you need to change a procedure based upon something that the police department brings in or something that the fire department brings in, or a new factory or business starts up near one of our schools that has hazmat or something like that, then every time we do that, it would have to come back for a policy change. And that's the major reason for policy advisory number 469.
So I noticed that the policy requires that the superintendent bring the emergency response plans to the board annually.
That's correct. The new emergency response plans in accordance with the incident command structure, which is a totally new structure brought into where when the police or fire shows up, we're all speaking the same language. The police becomes the incident commander on scene, takes over. All of that's being put into the emergency response plans now. The sites have identified their emergency response teams. They're in the process of, part of the formal process is that they go through training and certificates will actually go into the emergency response plans themselves. And then as they're finished, they'll be brought to the governing board by the superintendent for approval.
Because my experience, and it could have been that when I was in Scottsdale, we may have had some grant or something that made us start this process earlier, but I know going through getting all of the online courses and certifications and working with police and fire, and because I was in charge of the student information system and the data, identifying our response team in terms of evacuations and I can't even remember the terminology anymore. That's how I'm glad I don't have to worry about it. Reconnecting families with their students. So that we did this several years ago, and so what I'm trying to get a sense of is, do we feel like we're behind? Are we behind some schedule, or are we in the right timeline?
We're in the right timeline. They will be completed hopefully within the next 4 to 5 months. Some of them will be completed much sooner than that. So it's all as in the planning, the documentation, and we do have some schools with some unique issues, such as Creighton School, which does have businesses around it with hazmat. They've got a canal right behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So the police department, fire department are having to identify items that they've never had to identify or processes they've never had to be involved in. We're working with 2 different precincts in the fire department, so we're going with 2 different precincts' philosophies and what and how they do business, but they're having full input on these emergency response plans as well.
Any other questions on this policy? If not, we will move on to 472. Thank you, Mr. Stoltz. Please don't trip.
Good evening, President Moore and members of the board, and Dr. Boyd and Dr. Wagner. I'm here tonight to report on Policy Advisory 472, and by the way, I'm Dana Morrison, the Director of Special Services. Moving on. We're here to kind of take a look at revisions that you have in front of you, a yellow copy. It's in your folder. Kind of take a look at that. This policy is a direct reflection of the 2009 task force recommendations for best practices for special education and behavior management. And it came out of, as a result of Senate Bill 1197, and actually the policy itself is verbatim for what's in that task force, except for the areas that we have struck out, which is the confinement pieces. So we have, as a district, we're recommending removing the confinement pieces because they are not necessary or should not be used as disciplinary actions. And actually, the policy outlines the crisis management of when seclusion and physical management would be used in emergency situations only. And again, this bill actually put to the task of 9 individuals to look at proactive and best practices for managing behavior for any student, as well as students with disabilities, and which disciplinary action should be prohibited, as well as what kind of training should be available for staff, and then again the notice requirements. So if you take a look at your yellow page and you turn to let's see, the first strikeout is on page 22 of 38, where we have recommended that we remove the information there that's crossed out regarding confinement. And if you leaf through the rest of this policy, on page 23 of 38, we have also struck out the area that discusses confinement, and actually added the statement that Creighton School District does not allow for the use of confinement as a disciplinary action.
Ms. Morrison and Hilda, is this what we have in our board docs? No, so this is, okay.
If I could clarify, the things that we are striking out are the recommendations from ASBA for the policy. As we've examined the policy, we do not see a need for confinement. Seclusion, and Ms. Morrison will get to that, is a different thing, and it's an emergency provision. And so what we're saying is, even though they're recommending that we have all of this languages on confinement, we don't see a reason to use it as a disciplinary action, and therefore we are recommending that we take that language that they're recommending we put in and we exclude it, and we add a couple of statements.
So what we are looking at adopting is what is the yellow, not what is the...
Yeah, and for second
Correct.
reading, this will be part of your packet, not the other one. This
And-
is just first reading.
And I apologize for jumping in, I just wanted to get some clarity. So this current policy has a copyright from ASBA on it. Will, if this is adopted, will it still, not that we can't have one, but it would not have, okay. Okay, thank you.
So if you read through the pages, you will see wherever confinement is mentioned, it is we have struck it out as and recommending not including that. And as you read through the policy, and it talks about seclusion, that it should only be used in an emergency situation. It's not to be used as a punishment for violation of school rules. And then physical restraint is to be used as a last resort emergency safety measure. So again, it outlines pretty clearly when those practices would be appropriate. And again, notification to parents is part of that, part of the physical management, or if seclusion occurs. So, any questions?
So I have a question, and this might just be, what might be obvious, which is why it's not in there. So we're striking, which I don't disagree with, striking confinement, but we've also not defined what we believe confinement is, right? So it leaves to the discretion when we say we don't, that we do not allow for, I think I might use even more strict words like prohibits the use of, do not allow, like, I don't think you should do that. We either want students to be confined under certain circumstances or we don't. And if we create a policy where in particular we're going against ASBA's recommendation and we feel strongly about it, I think we should use perhaps stronger language in our version. But if I were to read this and I was a classroom teacher or a parent, I don't know what you mean by confinement. Does that mean that my child can't be put into timeout? Does that mean that my child can't be sent to another part of, the classroom, away from other children? Does that mean that they can't? So I think to say that we don't allow it or we prohibit the use of it, I think we should describe what we mean, because there's
And I
a
think
broad
that
range.
the reason, I agree with the term prohibits. I would just say that when you read the section on page 31 of 38 as it describes the use of seclusion, it gives a little bit more detail. But we can certainly come up with a statement that describes what confinement is that's being prohibited.
Especially because we're
And
taking
it doesn't
out.
include timeout.
Yeah.
And it doesn't include seclusion. Seclusion is for an emergency purpose only, and it has a whole different set of rules attached to it.
Well, in particular, because seclusion, in the definition of the use of seclusion, includes the confinement of a student.
Yes, it does.
So we're prohibiting confinement, but then in the use of seclusion will allow them to be
And
confined.
then the rest of the bullets define.
Yeah,
define
the nature of when it's appropriate to
Correct.
do that. So I'm just saying, if we can describe what we believe is that we're prohibiting, how do we operationalize confinement?
That's
So
what
that
she
it's
did.
very clear to our community what it is that we prohibit, so that there isn't a gray area if in the event that we have a student that's subjected to that type of discipline, which we prohibit, that we have a recourse to address that both with the staff, parents, or whomever else.
It's vague
Yeah,
between, because actually seclusion, and some of it uses the word confinement. So, again, that any of the seclusion or restraint practices would be used only in emergency. And it is interesting that the language that the confinement pieces were added in by ASBA. They were not part of the task force. The language in this document is word for word except for the confinement pieces. So when you do a comparison of that task force recommendation, so which was in 2009, 2010. So we can take a look and add that piece of a more definite definition for confinement. Is there anything, are there any other questions?
I just agree that that's a great idea, especially because there unfortunately have been some incidents across the country. And people just need to have as much clarity as possible about what is not acceptable, especially with students with disabilities.
And these policies are for all students that,
Yes.
again, seclusion or restraint could occur for any student. And currently we have forms when we put all of our teachers through CPI that are in special ed, our assistant principals. We do that training annually so that we are working on de-escalation techniques and strategies so that we are not in the position of doing physical management unless the child is in danger to self or others. So,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you. So that will conclude then, no further discussion. That will conclude our first reading. Okay, so we will move into the overview of the governing board budget.